So this time we're going to start a very new concept. This one is a data structure and it's called arrays. Basically, it's a list. And it's a very, very common thing you do in JavaScript and really any programming language. So step one, right, go and the link I've given you, I want you to check it out, right? Because I think these things give a pretty good description of what these are. And, list like objects, you might go list like, maybe I know that objects we haven't covered yet. So we cover objects probably next week, the second code along. Because once you do arrays, which you're going to see this week, then we do iteration next, which basically means now that we have a list, and here's your, if you've never seen an array, here's an example of an array. So there's some new syntax that we haven't seen, right? And so, these are square brackets, right? So an opening square bracket and an ending square bracket, which is great. And what happens is now the comma separates each item within the array, okay? And where this gets kind of interesting is when we try to then look at the array, which by the way, it also shows here, these are string, this is string data. You can also do numeric data. In here you can mix string data with numeric data, and this also shows multi-dimensional, which basically means you have an array and inside of that you have another array. We can find the length, right? We can access them, and this is where it starts to go like, okay, why? But let's actually see this. So again, read through this, look at it, at least be introduced to some of these terms like the index, the zero index, but let's actually get our hands in here. But before we do, something I want to show you that I realized last time that I've been struggling with and I just hadn't done it. So today I went and looked at it, and it was the idea that when I forget to put semicolons, how can I get my editor to kind of help me by doing them? And here's an example from last time, right? So where I didn't put semicolons on line 8, line 10, and line 12, what I could do is either select the whole function or I could just select these lines right here. In order to get them to be inserted, I can right click and I can say format selection with, and I can tell it prettier. Now I was trying to do this before and it wasn't working, but let me show you how I fixed it. First you do it. Of course, it's going to make a liar of me. Did I select it? Select format selection with. There it goes. Not sure why it didn't. Anyway, so now you can see that it's here. So how did I get this working? As I went into extensions, I found my prettier extension, right? So this, if you come down here, it lists all the extensions that you have loaded. If you come down to the gear icon and go to extension settings, and in here it shows you there's 29 settings for here. You can either search through here and look for semicolons, or you can just go up here and you can type semicolon. And notice I have whether to add at the end of each line. Okay, this before was unchecked, which is why it wasn't working for me. And I still haven't gotten it to automatically do it, so I still need to do a little investigation, but at least now, right, I can get it to handle that. Okay, so a little bit more code before we start writing, looking at arrays. So the first thing is I noticed, and this is going to be your first, this was from last time, right? So I'm actually going to get rid of this for a minute because those were your notes from last time. So I'm actually going to ask you a question here and see if you can answer it. So in the code base that we have one console.log that outputs, which by the way, I'm running live server, right? I have the output here, cool. And notice, but in the code I wrote, I only had one console.log, and I want to add another one up here. Now we'll talk about as we move forward maybe better places to put our output, because you really do want to keep your functions relatively, straightforward in what they do, like simple inputs, simple outputs. But in this case, where would we put, right? If I copied this and wanted to put it up here, would I put it before or after the return? Right? So I want you to answer that. So pause right now, right? Where do we put the console.log for the house? So now we're going to modify it. House size, right? Okay, so answer that. So do you remember me saying what will happen? By the way, pause, answer it, and then, right? If we put it here, again, I showed this before, but I think it's just worth noting. You can tell it's not going to run because notice how as soon as I paste it in, it kind of gave you a color, its visual hint, right? And what that means is, as soon as you hit return, right, as soon as the JavaScript hits the line 14, it goes back. It passes execution back to what called it, right, which is here. So in this case, I'm going to undo, and I would put it here, okay? So I would say based on the size, I'm just going to do it like this, and in this case, I would put size as the output, the variable itself, right? Because remember, I passed in size into the function. Right, even though it was numeric when I had an argument, right? And in this case, I would say house size points. No, wrong one. How do I know? I look up here, right? Which, by the way, we could talk about what would happen if I did use that one, okay? Notice what my editor is doing. It's trying to tell me, hey, I can't find that one because this is, right, block scoped. We're inside of this block, and this variable is only available inside of this block. Okay. So the more you code, the more you get used to concepts like that. So now what we're going to do is we're still going to return it, but now we at least have some output for both. Again, we'll probably write a function in a little while to do some of that output, maybe even for the discussion. Okay, so now that was your first thing. All right, so now let's talk about arrays. Okay, so let's do. So first, right, const my array equal open and close parentheses. Okay, open and close brackets. Sorry. So in here we can put whatever kind of data we want, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Easy for you to say. Okay. And now what we could do, so we could do console.log, and we'll do my array. Right. Now again, we're doing this all out on the globe. I'm going to show you in a minute how we can actually use these arrays as far as our in our code. And there's multiple ways you can do it, and I'm just going to begin with one easy one. All right. So now I'm going to move over to here. And because I have live server set up, automatically I see some output on my console. And this console.log is what's creating this output. And notice it says 5, and if you click this little arrow, it will show you that the length of this is 5, okay? But these little numbers here are the indices for each of the items inside the array. So if I wanted to view, right, 1, then I would have to, in my console.log, instead of just the array, I'm just going to copy it so I have it, right? Let's say I wanted to say show me only, output only, right, 1 item inside the array, and I could use my open and close, right, brackets, and then I could tell it here. Now the question is, which item is it going to output? And we can jump over and see. And this is where, right, it showed us on the console, again on line 63, making sure we understand when we're looking at the console where things come from, is that the index 1 is actually the number integer 2, because the first position in the array is 0 indexed. So it starts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I wanted to see the last item, right? Uh-oh, copy that. Right? If I wanted to see the last item, what would I do? I do 4. Okay? So this is just and again, this is a data structure in JavaScript that's very popular. And now the other thing I could do is I could do console.log, and I could do my array. And this is where we start looking at how do we manipulate these arrays, right? So I could actually say, how about if I wanted the 0 position, right? Actually, sorry. What if I wanted, there's a couple ways you could do this. Like we could do, if I wanted the 0 position to equal, right, 10. Would that work? What do you think? Sure. Okay. Now, let's actually go in and look. Now, by the way, at this point, you don't necessarily have to write code. You could just do my array. Okay. Now look what it did. Because what it said is, it said, hey, look at the position that you're referencing, right? In other words, the 0 position, which before was 1, and now it's just saying that is now equal to something new. Now, sometimes you might want to do that, but more likely what you want to do is this. You want to go my array, and this is a method called push, okay? And now we tell it what item we want to push, and we'll see where it ends up landing. Let's say 1. Okay, again. Now at this point, there's really no output. Let's see, 6. Yeah, it does push 1. It shows us. Let's just go ahead and look at it so we can see what happened, right? So what gets returned when we do this is the length. That's why 6 showed up. Now, how would we know that? Well, that's where we'd go to our handy reference, MDN, and we'd say arrays. And then in this case, we're using a very common method. Now, a method is basically just code that's written inside of the JavaScript. We could call it engine, but the language itself, right? And it says push is a method on array instant that adds a specific element to the end of the array, right? And then returns the length. Okay, so where did 1 go? At the end. And then what got returned to the console was 6. There's so many different arrays. So many different methods. Pop is a very common one. I'm sure we'll see toString is where we convert, right? toString returns a string, and we'll talk about why this can be important, right? And it shows you an example of numeric values and what it ends up doing when you call toString on an array. Notice what it does is it makes that into a string, strings together that entire content, right, into one string. It is no longer an array. So just helpful to kind of go through, especially in the beginning. You're not going to remember all these. Like if I was to say, what does splice do? Right? You're not going to remember that. But if you write code that does a splice, or you look through the code that's in here, more likely you will. So let's actually now that we've done this, right, let's actually think about, now, how could we use arrays? There's so many different ways we could use arrays in our code, right? Like we could set up an array. We could say my inputs, open and close. By the way, again, right, if I wanted to make my life easier, format with selection, prettier, does that semicolon, thank you. So right now, I have inputs that I'm passing into, right, I don't have inputs, I just have hard-coded values. Now eventually what will happen is on this program we're going to end up having a form that the user fills out to give us this information. So kind of a fun way to start thinking about that is we could put these inputs inside of an array. And we could say 5, comma. Okay. Now if we do that, then how do we use this array inside of here? Okay. Well, there's a couple of ways we could do it. Because this is out on the global space, right? We could do just pass my inputs, although we wouldn't really have to do that, but sometimes it's just good. Here, let me show you what I mean by that, rather than to do that. Because right now, what I could do here, because this is on global, right? Remember, right? And actually you can do it right here too, on the global scope. Okay, because it's on global scope, I have access to it within my block scope. Because when I say, right, if I reference something, and in this case I want to reference that 5 instead of placing it here, what would I do? I would do my inputs, open, right, and which position is that 5 in? It's in the 0 position, okay, the first index. And now I'm going to copy that. Okay, I'm going to come over here, and now what would that be, right? And in that case, it would be 1. So now what I'm doing is instead of, right, so now I can set up these or I can set up my inputs as an array. Now I'm actually going to do this another way in a second, but let's see, did this work? Was there any errors on the code? Well, let's come over here. Let's hit a breakpoint here. Right, so now we know we have an array on the global scope. When we hit start, right, when we run this, right, it references, it finds the value that is in my, and it actually shows you, notice how, which is kind of cool, right? Shows you 5 was passed in. Okay. Now it wasn't passed in this case, sorry, it's referencing it out on the global. So if I hit next, then in this case it passes 5 as a parameter into this function. We know what happens here. And by the way, I can just say jump over that, run that. We're done. Right, we're back here. Now we're going to do the second one. Okay, so we know that works. But really, more realistically, this is the way you would do this. I'm going to comment this out. And what I would do here is I would just take that array, copy it, and I would place it inside of the call. Okay? Now that, just look at that for a minute. So what we're doing now is we're saying invoke or call start, pass an array to it, and now how do I modify this function? Right? So that's actually a question I have. Just I want you to give it a like. So now my next question, let's see, where do I put this? We'll put it here. How do I modify the start parameters to use the array that is the argument? Okay, so stop right there. Give it a shot. Think about it. Right? And don't continue on until you at least have a thought about this. Right? All right, so pause here and then pick it up. I'll wait just a second. Okay. So here's how you do it. In here, right, we could give this array a variable name, kind of like what we did here, but by placing it here, we no longer need that global variable. Again, the idea is we minimize global variables. So you could call it my inputs, and I might just call it inputs to make it even a little simpler. Then if I do that, what has to change inside of here would just be to change, right, inputs. Now, do I have to change the name? No. Okay? But what this does, still runs, right? But now the difference is I no longer have a global variable called my inputs, but I am passing an array into the function. Now, you might wonder why, right? you'll see why as we move more towards forms later, and actually towards arrays, array of objects, but that's for later. Let's just say I copy this and I paste it. Now what I can do is I can run my start with different numbers, right? So I could say 4 and I could say large, right? So what this allows me to do, and let's just go watch it run, right? Let's actually just watch that run. I'm going to just take off my breakpoint so you can see. Okay. This is back up in here. So I've run this code, and some of this output's starting to get in the way. Actually, if I was, unless this stuff helps. If it helps, leave it in, right? I wouldn't mark off for that, but what I'm going to do is just to clean. And by the way, you can also make this output look a little cleaner as well. There's other ways we could do that, but at least now, right? At least now, and I could. There's just so many things I could do to this, but I'm going to stop my temptation to do it because I just want you to get this idea. So now, right, in your notes, do you understand passing arrays into functions, right? Okay. All right, so I'll give you another commit message here. We're going to pick this up. We're going to do a little more coding on this one, but I think this is a good place to stop. And let's see, do I have, if I don't have a commit, oh yeah, learning about arrays, I do. Okay, do that one.